Evening. My name is Craig Clark, the president of the Portsmouth Historical Society. I want to welcome you all to our third annual memorial program for Colonel Bert Quist. Bert was one of our three founders of the Battle of Rhode Island Association with Joe Stubbock and I. And he was very instrumental in just getting the organization going. He was a very calm presence, even though I'll say a calm, commanding presence, being a colonel. And he's just very, dearly missed. We really wish he was still part of our group, but we just always want to do this as long as possible, just to commemorate his time with us and his contributions to the group. So I just want to say I love her. I'd like to thank the Friends Meeting House for a short pivot here. We're starting our ADA access at the Historical Society, so we'll have a second floor lift installed. We're hoping by the September anyway. A little bit of a lead time on the elevator right now, but because of that, we have no second floor access right now and fire access. So the Friends Meeting House was gracious enough to sponsor our event or host us tonight. I'd like to introduce Matt Kent, one of the directors here, and he wants to say a couple words.
Thank you. Glad you all could come. We were happy to open up the facility for this tonight. It's kind of a short notice, but we reacted and got things to happen here. Just wanted to let you know, this building was built in 1700. This year we're celebrating 325 years of this building. And if you stop and think that, this was 75 years before the signing of the Declaration. It's amazing. But each month we've been having a different thing that we've been studying about the building as we celebrate the 325 years. We had the compact here in March. And one of the things that was brought to our attention was that in May that the Society of Friends had gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. And not many people realize that. We were the first religious people to get a Nobel Peace Prize. During wartime, they were not activists in the war, but they did provide aid and help rebuild. And at that point, they got the Nobel Peace Prize. In August, we're going to be having a dedication for the building. The building was put on the National Register in the 70s, but we never had a plaque or anything commemorating that. And August 9th, we're going to have a celebration here and have a plaque installed on the building. And the last quick thing I wanted to mention, as we were doing some research, being Juneteenth here, that's the new holiday, the Quakers were also known for their strong anti-slavery stance. They would get runaways that were coming up this way, and the runaways would be sent back into slavery unless they had a skill. And the Quakers would get the runaways and take them to the Bedford and Fall River and get them on whaling ships. That way they had a skill in the whaling industry and not be sent back. So that was another interesting thing that we found out. But again, I just want to thank you for coming tonight. And again, just to sit and think that all the souls that have been through this building, the meeting house and the church. During wartime, it was used as barracks and as a hospital. But if you just stop and think about all the people that have been through this building, how long it's stood, it's just amazing. Thank you.
We have a little celebration tonight. We are sponsoring the Historical Society started a scholarship last year, and this is our second annual scholarship. And we had 10 submittals, 11 submittals that students had to write an essay to the society, a little bit about history and themselves and their experience. And tonight we're awarding our second recipient to Mark Alcolea Vila. He's a transfer student. Really moved to Portsmouth about 3 years ago. He spent his whole career here in Portsmouth, high school career. And he talked about his experience moving to Portsmouth. I can imagine what a culture shock that was. But Mark is very accomplished. He's a president of the Language and Honor Society, team captain of PHS varsity swim team, 3 years, founder, president of the film club, member of the PHS engineering team, member of the PHS math team, National Honor Society, National Science Honor Society, outdoor track and field, president of the Language Honor Society, volunteer and tutoring, National Honor Society, St. Mary's Parish, weekly director. Very, very accomplished, Mark. It's like reading my own resume here almost. But I want to invite you up here, Mark, for the presentation, and the board members as well, please. Some board members for a picture opportunity. Let Becky do the honors. It's going to Rice University in Houston. Congratulations.
You want it out?
We have Thomas here too.
Yes.
Mark, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very appreciated.
I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, talking about British deserters from Rhode Island. Presentations by Don Hagist, is managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution. His historical studies focus on presenting an accurate picture of individual soldiers and their families, especially those of the British Army who served in America. This research is done using exclusively primary sources, mostly from archives in North America and Europe. He is a consultant for the PBS documentary, The American Revolution, produced by Ken Burns, and has written several recent books, including Noble Volunteers, The British Soldiers Who Fought the American Revolution, The Revolution's Last Man, The Soldier Behind the Photographs, and These Distinguished Corps, British Grenadier and Light Infantry Battalions in the American Revolution. Don is an engineer for a major medical device manufacturer and also writes for several well-known syndicated cartoonists. Don Hagist.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you all for coming out on a very warm day. Fortunately, it's not so bad here. Congratulations to the scholarship winner. That's really awesome. Before I start, I want to take a minute to acknowledge Juneteenth, which is a really important date in the history of the United States that maybe a lot of us don't know much about. It's a great time to learn a little bit more about Rhode Island's role in both the slave trade and the emancipation movement, because it's very important for people today to study issues in history where there were very strong voices on both sides of an issue, because we still have issues like this today with strong voices making good points on both sides. And emancipation and Rhode Island's role in it was just such an issue. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is British soldiers who served in Rhode Island during the American Revolution. And I like to talk about these people as individuals. How many people here are familiar with the Diary of Frederick Mackenzie? You want to hear that? Okay, good number of hands, that's good. Frederick Mackenzie was a staff officer in the British garrison here in Rhode Island, and he did the great service of keeping a detailed diary that covers a year and a half of the British occupation in Rhode Island, which was 3 years long. So we kind of get half of a really good story out of his diary. And he has a lot of entries that look like this one. A soldier of the 22nd Regiment and one of the 54th deserted last night. Okay, a soldier deserted. I look at that and I say, well, wouldn't it be cool if we knew who that person was? I mean, a soldier, but he was a real person. Well, it turns out that you can find out who that guy was with archival research. There's no publication that's going to tell you, but the information exists. And the soldier in the 22nd Regiment was named Robert Hall. Okay, great, he's got a name. And then you dig a little farther and you can find out he was born in 1753 somewhere in England, and he was 5 feet 9 inches tall. Well, now he starts to become a little bit of a person. And he enlisted in the British Army in 1770 in May. So he was 17 years old, which is on the young side for a British enlistee. And he deserted just a few months after he enlisted. Well, that's kind of interesting. But he was caught, he was put in jail. This all happened in England. And he returned to the regiment on October 12th, 1770, okay? And with more study of British regiments, you find that recruits sometimes did desert. And then he deserted again in Rhode Island in September 1777. We know this, and we know he ended up in Providence just a few days later. And then in Providence, he enlisted in a Massachusetts regiment on September 6, 1777. So just 5 days after he deserted. How about that? And he was discharged that November, so he just had a short little bit of service. And if you're really, really familiar with the British occupation of Rhode Island, you'll know that some very important things happened in that 2 months that he was there. Anybody know what was going on then? This was the first serious American attempt to unseat the British garrison from Rhode Island in October 1777. Yeah, there were some little battles that happened here in Rhode Island that don't get the same attention that the big one did. He enlisted again in March 1779 and wrote his enlistment till the end of the war. And then in 1820, he was still living in Bethlehem, New York. So he settled here. He got a land grant after serving the Continental Army. So all of a sudden we start with just this little bland entry that doesn't tell us anything, but when we get into primary source documents, we can find a whole lot about this person, and that's what I think is really cool. So let's talk about this garrison a little bit. The British had a garrison in Rhode Island for almost 3 years, from December 8, 1776 to October 25th, 1779. It consisted of British, German, and Loyalist troops. I'm going to be talking only about the British troops. And I'm going to repeat that a few times just to avoid questions that I don't know the answer to later on. Everything I talk about here is just about the British. There are other people who study the Loyalists and who study the Germans, and it's a lot to study, so I just take one slice of it. There was a strong naval contingent here, which means that not only were there sailors on their ships, but there were sailors on shore too, because you can't spend your whole life on the ship. There were some British Marines. So overall, in 1777, it was about 3,500 soldiers in 3 British regiments and 4 German regiments. In the middle of 1778, this increased by about 1,000 men, and then there were some other changes. So let's look at the British regiment. When I say a regiment, that's about 500 soldiers. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb throughout the American Revolution. And even till today, when you see the word regiment, if you think of it as about 500 men, that's in the ballpark. You know, the sizes may be above or below, but if you see there were 20 regiments here and 10 there and this and that, this gives you a sense of the scale of what they're talking about. So who were they? Well, there were 3 British regiments. The British Army numbered their infantry regiments. So we had the 22nd Regiment, the 43rd Regiment, and the 54th Regiment landed in Rhode Island on December 8, 1776. A lot of other British troops landed too at that time, but these 3 regiments stayed. Once the island was secured and it was clear that there was not going to be any fighting in 1776, most of the British troops that initially landed here sailed back to New York in early 1777. These 3 British regiments and 4 German regiments stayed behind. Most of the things that happened in Rhode Island involving British soldiers involved men from some of these 3 regiments. In the 22nd and 43rd, it wasn't actually the whole regiment. A British infantry regiment had 10 companies, each 1/10 of the total size. So how many men would be in a company if it's 1/10 of the size of a regiment? About 50, yeah. Again, that's not an exact number. That's just a general number for easy thinking. So there are only 8 companies of these 2 regiments here in Rhode Island. The 54th Regiment, on the other hand, had all 10 of its companies here. And then in July 1778, the 38th Regiment arrived with 10 more companies. And some more German and Loyalist troops arrived at that time as well. And then the 54th Regiment departed in June 1779, and the other 3 regiments, the 22nd, 38th, and 43rd, stayed until October, when the island was evacuated once and for all by the British. So these are the regiments we're talking about. Just for reference, sometimes if you read books about the American Revolution, sadly, you'll see terms like the Cheshire Regiment and the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry and the Lincolnshire Regiment. These county titles were not given to British regiments until 1782, so they have nothing to do with British service in Rhode Island. They just sound cool, so people like to use them, but there's no relevance to that. Now let's talk a minute about desertion. We're on an island. So it's kind of hard to desert from an island, right? Except Rhode Island is an island, but it's not very far away from the mainland, as you can see in the map here. When I talk about Rhode Island, I am talking exclusively about this big island that is Aquidneck Island, that some people from out of state will even call Newport for the whole island, right? During the 18th century, this was Rhode Island, and everything else was Providence Plantations, right. Today it's Providence Suburbs, I think is what they call it. But when I say Rhode Island, I'm using the terminology of the day, which was the island. And you can see that there's a few places where it's really, really close to the mainland in the upper left there. And then it's really not far from the mainland anywhere. So that makes desertion a little bit easier. And when you have a population that isn't particularly supportive of the British government and not particularly enthusiastic about having a British garrison here, you get a lot of cooperation from local people in helping soldiers desert. For example, on the night of January 9th and 10th, 1778, we have, again, Frederick Mackenzie writes in his diary, 2 soldiers of the 22nd Regiment deserted last night from the advanced posts and made their escape, notwithstanding they were pursued as soon as they were missed. Now, the advanced posts are the northern part of the island, like right here, for example, in Windmill Hill, which is usually called Butts Hill today, but the British called it Windmill Hill, and it's only fitting that there's a great big old wind turbine on it now, just as a reminder. But that's where the advanced posts were. 2 soldiers made their escape, notwithstanding they were pursued. As the rebels always have boats ready to take off deserters, it is extremely difficult to apprehend them. You know there's a fort up there on that hill. The British built a fort there, the French rebuilt a fort there, but because the British had a fort there, the Americans had their own forts. In Bristol and in Tiverton, they had soldiers right down along the shore. They had boats. So during the night, it's not so hard for a British soldier to sneak off, get down to the shoreline, wave his arms, and here comes the boat. Well, we find that in the Rhode Island Council of War papers, they write, John Dowland and Joseph Denham, 2 persons who lately deserted the enemy's service at Rhode Island, are to be paid $10 each to support themselves until they can get into some business. So, wow, not only are they getting support by a boat picking them up, but then they go into Providence and the state government gives them money. So there's some incentive for these guys to desert. Joseph Denham, I haven't been able to trace what happened to one of the 2 guys, but Joseph Denham enlisted in a Massachusetts regiment on January 18th, 1 week after he deserted, which sounds like, okay, he turned to the patriot cause, right? He was a deserter from the British, but he enlisted in the Americans, except that if you keep looking, you find that he deserted from the American Army 1 month after he enlisted into it. So some guys just don't want to be soldiers, right? Nationalities of deserters. This is the British Army. There are books that will call it the English Army. And that's kind of like saying the American Army is the Virginian Army or something. You know, not all British people are English, but all English people are British. Each regiment had a mix of nationalities. Each of these regiments that were in Rhode Island recruited from all over Great Britain. So they were not recruiting just regionally during this era. That all came later on in British history. There were even some recruits in these regiments from the European continent. We'll talk about a few of them later. So just as an example, in the 22nd Regiment of Foot in 1778, I don't know the nationalities of all of the soldiers who were in the regiment at this time. So I know the nationalities of some, and I can guess a lot of the other ones based on their names, names like Mackenzie or O'Neill or what have you. And we come up with, there were about 263 English, 161 Scottish, 117 Irish, and 39 what the British called foreigners, which in this case were almost all continental Europeans, although that includes 1 or 2 Americans and other places that are not Great Britain. And this is a pretty typical mix for a British regiment. If you took the 43rd or the 38th, you wouldn't see these same numbers, but you'd see similar proportions. Roughly half English, a quarter Scottish, and a quarter Irish in most British regiments serving in America during the Revolutionary War. Now the desertions, there's a little error on this slide. We have 119 known deserters from Rhode Island during this time, from British regiments during the 3 years. 119 total deserters, 121 total desertions, because 2 of the guys got caught and then deserted again. We'll talk a little more about that. So far, I've been able to determine the nationality of only 41 of them with certainty. There's some I can guess, but I don't like to use guesswork for these kind of statistics. And I got 16 English or Scottish soldiers, because the records don't tell us which one, 9 Irishmen, and 16 foreigners. Now you could look at that slide and say, wow, so the British and Scottish, the English and Scottish were just as likely to desert as the foreigners. But if we look at proportions, remember there are a lot more Englishmen in the regiment? The proportions look this way. So from this you can see that, oh, the Irishmen, again, based on this 41, based on the 1/3 of them that we know about, Irish were twice as likely to desert as the English and Scottish. And the foreigners were crazy more likely to desert. That's like a quarter of the foreign troops deserted. So this just shows why it's important to put numbers in context, right? So that's a little bit we know about nationalities. Let's look at another guy. Here's one of the foreigners, Leonard Carl. Now, he's tricky because his name shows up sometimes as Leonard and sometimes as Cornelius, but we know, because there was nobody else with the last name Carl and some other reasons, that it's the same guy. He was born in 1757 in Waldsmundsbach, Odenwald, in the German states. The British did a lot of recruiting in Hanover, which was a protectorate of Great Britain. So it was under the British Crown, and picked up a lot of recruits from all over Europe who were in Hanover, and put these men into the ranks of British regiments. Don't confuse this with a Hessian soldier. That was a totally different thing. This is a red coat, a continental European serving in a British regiment. 5'7.5" tall, Catholic, enlisted at the age of 19 in Worms in the German states. Either late 1775 or early 1776, he enlisted. And he left his post, went on the cattle guard here in Rhode Island on the night of May 15th, 1778. If I remember correctly, this occurred down near the town of Newport. He was found under a fence a few days later. Well, the terminology under a fence, we would say behind a fence today, but close up against it, but behind a fence. And he was tried for desertion. So he wasn't tried until few months after he deserted, but he was tried. And what he said at his trial was that he went to the swamp for water and lost his way, which may be his good fortune, because a swamp might not be the best place to get water, but that's what he said. And the court didn't buy it for 1 minute. They found him guilty. They sentenced him to death. It's entirely possible that they gave him this harsh sentence in particular because he was the 5th German to desert from the 43rd Regiment so far, out of only 27 altogether. So they may have been getting tired of this behavior. Desertion is a capital crime. Doesn't mean that you're going to always get sentenced to death, but you can be. He was sentenced to death. And we know that he died on June 13th, 1779, but what we don't know is whether he was executed or if he died of some other cause. The British muster roll for his regiment records his death, but not the cause of death. So leaves a little mystery, and the information might turn up from some other source. Let's look for a minute by length of service now. We saw a guy who enlisted in 1770 and deserted, and then we just saw a guy who enlisted in 1776 and deserted. So for ease, I divided these deserters into two categories. I said, let's talk about guys who enlisted before the war began and guys who enlisted after the war began. Now, when you enlisted in the British Army, for the most part in the 18th century, it was a voluntary enlistment. For the most part, the soldiers in Rhode Island were all, actually, I think I can say exclusively, the soldiers in Rhode Island were all volunteers because the British, for the most part, had an entirely volunteer army. Navy's a different story, but the Army, voluntary enlistments only during this part of the war. And roughly 3/4 of these guys had enlisted before the American Revolution began. So they were career soldiers who enlisted in the Army and then they got sent off to fight in a foreign war. About 1/4 of the soldiers in the Rhode Island Garrison enlisted after the war began, which doesn't tell you their reasons why necessarily, but it just gives a sense of who was here. Out of 119 deserters, 84 of them enlisted after the war began, which doesn't tell us why they deserted, but it's interesting to me that they were mostly new guys. There were some who had been in the Army for only a year or even less. They were new recruits who arrived in Rhode Island. Some had enlisted in 1775 before their regiments were sent to America, but still they get here, they're in the war, they desert. It just tells us something about the kinds of people deserters were, particularly when you're talking about an army of voluntary enlistments of career soldiers. The majority of deserters were ones who enlisted after the war started. Let's look at one of these, though, to add a little more texture to them, because things aren't always as they seem or as you suspect when you just say a guy deserted. Here's Thomas Cook, born 1751, St. Mary's Parish, Limerick, Ireland. He was a tobacconist by trade, so he had learned to trade before he joined the Army. As far as we can tell, he was illiterate because the one document we have that he wrote on, he signed with his mark rather than an actual signature. He enlisted in the 54th Regiment of Foot in May 1775. Very typical enlistment age in the early 20s. Most British soldiers enlisted in the Army in their early 20s. He was tried for desertion in August 1777. He deserted, but he was caught. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death, but he was not executed. He was pardoned in early 1778. He continued to serve in the Army. He was drafted into another regiment and served in the West Indies in 1796. So you can see that just because he deserted doesn't mean that he ended up being a terrible soldier. 10 years later, still in the Army. He was discharged in October 1797, got a pension for 22 years of service, and they said at that time he was worn out. He was no longer able to lead the rigorous life that a soldier had to lead, but he wasn't done working for the British government. He served in a garrison battalion for 4 years. This is a group that serves in England. They're not good for foreign service, but they can do local service. And then he became an ordinary seaman in the British Navy. In 1805, his ship was captured and he became a prisoner of war with the French. In 1814, he served again for 23 days in the Royal Navy. So on the one hand, it's like, oh gosh, he was a deserter. But turns out, even though he was convicted of desertion and sentenced to death, he ended up having quite a career in the British military. So not always what you see on the surface. Here's all of the desertions that I've been able to find. I'm pretty sure it's pretty close to all of them, if not all of them. We get this information from British regimental muster rolls. This includes the 4 British infantry regiments that spent most of their time in the Rhode Island Garrison during the war. It does not include the Royal Artillery, for which I have not yet accessed the records, even though they exist. And we see some patterns here. Let's go back a little tick here. We start in January 1777, right after the British troops arrive. And for the first couple of months, we have hardly any desertion. And then when June comes around, suddenly we go from like some months with one, some with none, All of a sudden we have 6 in June, 8 in July, 4 in August, 8 in September, 6 in October. What's the difference? Weather, and the weather influences one other aspect of the life of a soldier. It's where they're living. Yeah, they go from quarters, mostly in town, to encampments, mostly in the northern parts of the island. And remember how close those northern parts of the island are to the mainland? So we go from quarters to encampments in June, and desertion goes right up. It also helps that they've been here a while. The soldiers start to know the lay of the land. They know the local people. And then we get back into November to May of, Oh yeah, that's right. Why did I write it that way? Both 1777 and 1778, when you go from November to May, the troops are mostly back in winter quarters again. So they're mostly not up at the northern posts. Desertion goes down. And desertion also starts to vary significantly regiment to regiment because they send one regiment at a time up to the northern posts during the winter months. And guess what happens in that one regiment compared to the others? Desertion goes up. And we get to August 1778, the island's under siege. Now there's swarms of American troops on the island, and if we go down to 1778, you see in August, desertion goes way up. First time we have a 2-digit number, because now there's American troops everywhere. August of 1779, desertion goes up again. We get the second 2-digit number. Why? Now people are talking about, hey, you know, we might be evacuating the island. There's talk, people starting to pack up heavy equipment. Maybe we're going to leave. Well, for this soldier who maybe has been working a part-time job at a local farm, he might not want to leave. And for that one who married a woman from Newport, he might not want to leave. So they start. And even this guy who says, I hate being in the army. One way to desert is to run away. Another way to desert is to just hide and wait for the army to go away. That also works, right? So for different reasons, when it becomes apparent that the garrison's going to be evacuated, desertion increases. And this pattern exists no matter where the British Army stayed in North America. When it gets time to leave a place that they've been for a while, desertion increases. Let's look at Benjamin Millet. Some of you here might possibly have heard of this guy before, and I'll tell you why in a minute. He was born in 1758 in Somersetshire. 5'9" tall, brown hair, fresh complexion. He was a laborer, which just means he didn't pursue any other skilled trade. He enlisted in England sometime between 1775 and 1777. Arrived in Rhode Island in the middle of 1777, and he deserted on September 26, 1779, which was shortly before the island was evacuated. So he probably knew darn well, the army's getting ready to leave, and I want to stay. And he enlisted in the Rhode Island Regiment in 1782, which is where we get some of this data from. And then he settled in Johnston, Rhode Island, eventually. He spent a lot of time in Windham, Connecticut, and then came back to Rhode Island. He was still living in Johnston in 1818 and 1820. He got a pension from the US government. And another reason I know about him is because some of his descendants still live in the area. I've met 2 of them so far, which is kind of cool. Because these people, not only are they interesting to me because they served in the American Revolution, but they have this legacy that's still around us here. Why do these people desert? Oh, it's so fun to speculate on why soldiers desert. And one thing that is important to me as a historian in the introduction, you said he only uses primary source documents. And because I'm an engineer by profession, I look for what I call metadata. I like to get big amounts of data to put these individuals into context. You know, you saw the nationalities thing. I like to look at lots of people to learn how an individual was similar or different from his other people around him. But what I don't like to do is guess why people did anything, because I don't know what's going on in their heads. So the only reasons I really trust for desertion is when they tell me why they deserted. The limitation is that when they tell me why they deserted, it's usually because they were on trial for it because they got caught. And that might just skew the data a little bit. But after looking at over 800 trials of deserters of British soldiers in America, including the ones who were tried for desertion from Rhode Island, we find that drunkenness was a common theme. We find that fear of punishment was a common theme. So a soldier was in trouble for something or other. He may have been drunk and fallen asleep and missed his duty assignment. And now he knows he's going to get punished because he didn't show up when he should. And he's scared. I don't want to be punished. I might try to hide. I don't know what to do. I'm going to panic. I'm scared. Eventually leads to desertion. Might be discontent with the army. You know, some people enlist thinking that was a good idea and they hate it. Good thing that never happens again, right? Some people enlist just because they just don't like being in the army. Some people enlist because they have a sense of wanderlust. I want to travel. I want to do my own thing. This will be cool. This will be exciting. And I always say these people wander into the army and then they wander back out of it again. Local attachments is a very important reason. We talked about that a little bit. This is Rhode Island. What a beautiful place to live, right? You're working maybe as a tenant farmer in England. You don't like that. You enlist in the army. You come to here. This place is gorgeous, right? Why not stay here? And then you find out maybe I'll be able to get some land and my own farm here in America. That's a great reason to stay. Peer pressure. Some men in their trials say, well, that other guy talked me into it. I decided to go with him. He successfully deserted. I got caught. I had a change of heart. He didn't. Who knows? I've recently started to find hints, but not enough information to quantify, that some people actually enlisted in Great Britain, particularly Irishmen, because they just wanted some way to get to America. And, that regiment's deploying to America, or they're already in America getting recruits. If I enlist, I can get a passage there, and then I can sneak off. And did I mention drunkenness? Because there's a theme here. Here's a few testimonies. 5 of the deserters from Rhode Island who were caught and stood trial. One fellow, a German in the 22nd Regiment, said he was in liquor when he went from his tent and had no design to desert. Leonard Carl, we mentioned him already, said he went in search of water to the swamp and lost his way. Not an unusual reason, especially when you're in a foreign country, you get lost. And then you don't show up for roll call. You're written off as a deserter. You might not be trying to desert, but you don't know where you are. Robert Nunn, the 43rd Regiment, said, well, Sergeant McCoy struck me and used me very ill. And I was in liquor at the time and went off and did not know what I was doing. These are all written in the third person because they're transcripts from the court recorder who said, he said this, he said that. So again, he was kind of angry with the army and his sergeant, but also in liquor, didn't know what he was doing. William Hawkins from the 43rd Regiment, having through liquor absented himself so long from the regiment as to dread returning. So again, he got drunk, he wandered off. By the time he sobered up, he said, oh boy, it's been a couple of days, I'm in trouble now. William Bennett of the 54th Regiment said his leaving the regiment was owing to liquor and the dread of punishment hindered his return. Do you see there's a little bit of a theme going on here? Again, we can't discount what an important cause it was that soldiers with nothing to do get drunk, they wander off, they end up being scared because now they have been absent without leave, they end up deserting. But we also can't discount that this is guys who are on trial for the capital crime of desertion, and they really don't want to be found guilty, so they're trying to look for what sounds like a good excuse. So their intentions may be skewed just by the source of the data, right? We're almost done here. Here's a trial, and here is an example of a slide that I totally messed up. I put the wrong picture on it, or actually I just turned the picture sideways when I didn't mean to. This is an example of a British court-martial from the British National Archives in England, where most of this stuff comes from. And sadly, if it was the right orientation, you'd see that it has a whole thing at the top about we convened this trial. Here's all the members of the court. here's the guy on trial for desertion, and it's a much longer picture if it wasn't turned sideways. And, I've read many hundreds of these. Alexander McFarland said, one of the witnesses in the trial said, well, he was missing from camp at 5 a.m. on June 15th, 1777. All right. And this was a sergeant testifying he was missing, so I searched his tent. And I found that his clothing was missing. Now, the court is trying to discern intent. They know the guy was missing. That's a no-brainer. Was he trying to desert? Well, if you go look at his stuff, and you find that all his stuff is still there, that's a good sign that maybe he was not trying to run away. But if his spare clothes are all gone, he packed. That's a little more suspicious. Another witness saw him going into a building in town in Newport and detained him. So this was another soldier in his regiment. What's he doing here? Followed him into the building, held on to him, called the sergeant. That sergeant took him back to camp and said, after he was detained, he said that he had sold his clothing to an inhabitant. Well, okay. That's also against military law. You can't sell your clothing. So So that doesn't exonerate him, but that gives him an excuse for why his clothing is missing. He also said the inhabitant gave him money and a horse. Well, why would a guy do that? Maybe to inveigle him to desert. And the inhabitant promised to arrange for a boat to take him off. Now, the British know this kind of stuff has been going on. They don't identify the inhabitant because William McFarland probably didn't know his name, or Alexander McFarland, rather. In his defense, he said he was met by an inhabitant who gave him a bottle of rum. Okay, now we're starting to get that other usual thing. And told him if he was to leave the island, he would agree with a man to take him off. So, Americans started doing this in Boston in 1774 when there was a British garrison there, and they did it a lot in Rhode Island in 1776 through 1779, trying to convince these soldiers to leave their posts and desert. I can help you out. I can get you out of the army. I can get you a boat. We might be able to get you a farm to work on. Who knows? But McFarland said, I didn't want to desert. The inhabitant told him if he wished to go to town next day, he would let him have a horse, which he accordingly got. Soldiers don't usually have horses. He again met the man who showed him a boat in which he might be taken away the next evening. But McFarland said, I assure you I have no such sentiments. Now, Ren, he's talking to a court that's putting him on trial for desertion, so hard to know his real intentions. And the court decided, anybody? I've kind of summarized it. In this case, they decided that he was not guilty. The charge of desertion is not proven. He got off on this one. Lucky guy. The charge of desertion is not fully proved and doth therefore acquit him. All right, we're going to look at, I think, 2 more people. So hang in there. We're almost done. 3 more people. Was there a high desertion rate? I talked about 119 deserters and 121 desertions. That sounds like a big number, right? But we need context. We need proportions. You'll find a lot of American writers will talk about desertion rates being high without really having looked at details and found context for the information. So we've got a 3-year occupation, almost 3 years, by British troops. It ended up being about 2,000 soldiers. I haven't gotten an exact figure yet. It is possible to get an exact figure, but I don't quite have it. So it may have been a little bit more than that. And this includes attrition. During these 3 years, new soldiers arrive, recruits arrive, and whatnot. 119 deserters altogether, including two repeats. Should be 121 desertions and 119 deserters, which works out to about 6%. So is that a high rate of desertion? Compared to what? Well, let's compare it to European armies in the 18th century in general, based on studies by a colleague of mine. And again, this is a generality because sometimes desertion rates are high and sometimes they're low. But in general, throughout European armies in the 18th century, this is a low desertion rate. And compared to the Continental Army during the American Revolution, it's a pretty low desertion rate. 15 to 25% in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. So again, you can look and say, wow, 119 deserters, that's a lot. Well, in context, it's not a lot. Frederick Mackenzie wrote in August 15th, 1777, the Americans had landed on the island 1 week before this. And he wrote, 47 deserters having come over to our army since the Americans landed on the island. So the British lose 119 soldiers in 3 years. The Americans lose 47 soldiers in 1 week. So it shows the difference. Now again, it's skewed a little bit because there were also German deserters and loyalist deserters during these 3 years. But still, proportion just from the British regiments alone is not high by any standard. 2 more guys, Francis Overton and Daniel Sullivan. Sullivan was born in 1752, somewhere in Ireland. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, well set with black curly hair. And his left thumb, the upper joint, was put out so that he could slip it in and out. And by the way, he can read and write well, which is not unusual for a British soldier. Joined the 22nd Regiment of Foot in March 1775, just before the regiment sailed for America. And Francis Overton was born in 1756 in Ireland, 5 feet 10 inches tall, dark eyes, dark hair, dark complexion, a sprightly, well-limbed man who speaks broad. Imagine an Irishman who speaks broad, right? He enlisted in the 22nd Regiment between 1775 and early 1776. So after the regiment was already in America, he came here as a recruit. And they deserted on September 3rd, 1777 from Rhode Island. Frederick Mackenzie, the diarist, said, 2 soldiers of the 22nd Regiment deserted last night. And as they were seen going towards Newport, there is no doubt there are some persons there who make it their business to entice the soldiers to desert and assist them in making their escape. Another diarist, an inhabitant of the area, said, last night 2 soldiers belonging to the 22nd Regiment deserted. A reward of $100 was offered to any person who will take them or shoot them. Well, as it works out, nobody did take them or shoot them because we know that they arrived in Providence 3 days after they deserted. Not unusual. And the Rhode Island Council of War voted to give them each $6 to carry them into the country so they could find work. And they did find work. What work do you suppose they found? They enlisted in the 5th Massachusetts Regiment on September 8th, 1777. So 5 days after deserting from the British Army. And they used their own names when they enlisted, which is how we know this happened, because you can't look at this desertion on these days and their enlistment in those days with those names and say, oh, maybe it's different people. Got to be the same ones. And also, we see this kind of thing a lot going in both directions during the war. Why not use an alias? Well, you could ask it differently and say, why use an alias? You're on the other side. Who cares? Well, you left that army, they're looking for you. They're not going to find you in the American camp. So why not use your own name? It only makes sense. So most deserters from either side used their same names when they enlisted in the other side, because why have an alias? Doesn't matter. And on October 8th, 1 month after enlisting in the 5th Massachusetts Regiment, Francis Overton deserted. And on December 7th, 2 months after, Sullivan deserted. Okay. For most deserters, this is where the trail goes cold because one is I'm steeped in British military records. It's hard to research these guys. You have to do a lot of sifting through a lot of material, and it's very time consuming. If anybody would like to fund my research for a few years, please let me know. But takes a while to do this. Also, if anybody would like to do this kind of work themselves, let me know, and we can talk about that. They deserted, but then an amazing thing happens. We get a newspaper called the Norwich Packet of February 2nd, 1778. And it has an advertisement in it that says, "Stop, thieves! came to the house of the subscriber on the 25th of January, 1778, one James Hamilton and one Patrick Bryan. And it goes on and gives descriptions. And I say, well, who cares? But then the ad goes on and says, both these fellows were Irishmen said to desert from the 22nd Regiment on Rhode Island the 6th day of September last. And guess what? Those are the only two guys who deserted on 6th of September last from Rhode Island were Francis Overton and Daniel Sullivan. When you desert and you stay on the same side of the river, then you do change your names, right? They had passes from Governor Cook at Providence to go into the country and get work. Well, we saw that from the Council of War Papers, right? They tarried with me till Friday the 30th, till after dinner, then went off without paying for their board and carried off one white holland shirt and sundry other things to the value of $22 or $23. Whoever will take up the said villains and bring them to Norwich or New London jail so that justice may be done by them shall have $6 reward, all necessary charges, paid by Ebenezer Grover. And that's the last I know of them, unfortunately, because once they desert from the American side and change their names, odds are pretty good that they change their names again. Now it would be really hard to trace them further, and I just haven't made an attempt at it. Again, anybody who wants to use this data and do their own searching is welcome to it. We're going to look at one last person, Alexander Jack. You could say, who cares about all this, right? Well, I mean, I care, right? And now all of you care. But those descendants of Benjamin Millett still living in the area I talked about, they care. And here's a guy named Alexander Jack, born 1743 in, I say probably in Scotland. I should update this slide because I'm sure he was born in Scotland. And he joined the 22nd Regiment of Foot in 1773 when that regiment was in Scotland. He deserted from Rhode Island on October 10th, 1779. Significance of that date is?
They were leaving.
It was right before the British were evacuated. Yeah, so odds are pretty good that he wanted to stay in Newport. And I say odds are good because he did, in fact, stay in Newport. He settled here. He shows up in the census in 1782 as being married with 2 children. It's possible that he married a local woman. I don't know who he married yet. He died in 1821. His obituaries in the newspaper talks about him being a good, upstanding citizen. Why am I talking about him in particular? Because his son became a shoemaker in Newport, and this is his house. Still there. Belongs to the Newport Historical Society now, I think. But this is one reason why these people are kind of important. The Newport Historical Society just assumed because of this name that this man was a freed slave who built this house. But he correlates absolutely perfectly to a deserter from the 22nd Regiment in Rhode Island. If you want to learn more about these British soldiers, this book, Noble Volunteers, is a social history of them. It's not focused on Newport specifically, but about British soldiers who served in America during the war, and includes a lot of people who served in Rhode Island. And this other one, British Soldiers, American War, is a collection of 9 first-hand accounts by British soldiers. There are very few memoirs or diaries or journals or narratives written by British soldiers who served in America. I found all the ones known to exist so far. 9 of the 11 are in this book, along with essays to put them in context. Sadly, none of them served in Rhode Island. Hopefully someday we'll find something, a detailed account by a guy who served in Rhode Island, but they're out there in the lobby. If you like these anecdotes about British soldiers, I have a blog with lots of them, also about soldiers' wives and soldiers' children in America. My email address, and I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which you can subscribe to absolutely free on the internet. And I will be happy to take any questions that you all might have. Thank you. I have a question back here.
Were the desertion rates, covered the entire revolution, were the desertion rates similar, let's say, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or in the South and Carolinas?
Okay, so with the desertion rates in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas from the British Army, similar. They had a similarity in that they were highly changeable depending on exactly where the Army was and what was going on. For example, ever hear of the Battle of Stony Point in 1779? British sent a bunch of troops up the Hudson River Most of them landed on the east side of the river in, I don't know what county it is, but for Planks Point, they encamped there. And the British Grenadier battalions, for some reason that I cannot determine, had a very high desertion rate just for a while. British troops posted in Canada during the war had a very low desertion rate. When the British departed Philadelphia, the desertion rate went way up in 1770. So highly variable and highly related to local conditions. The overall desertion rate, I haven't tried to fix on that yet, but based on the general evidence I have from a few regiments and things, still looks like it's going to end up being around 5 or 6 or 7%, if that answers the question. But the key is that it's highly variable. Difficult campaigns like Cornwallis's campaign through the Carolinas or Burgoyne's campaign from, well, trying to get to Albany, you're liable to see higher desertion rates than from the garrison in New York City in 1777, for example. Other questions? Here's one.
When they enlisted in the Army, was it for a specific time?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
If you want to get a lot of detail on that question. But in general, when you enlisted in the British Army, you just enlisted. In peacetime, you enlisted for no fixed period, and you served until you were no longer fit for service. Fit for service means that you're capable of marching 15 or 20 miles a day and camping in perhaps rugged conditions for most of the summers and things like that. You can be deployed overseas. At the end, when you're no longer fit for service, which for most guys, if they don't have any injury, you can be fit for service into your mid-40s, early 50s is pretty common. Then you get discharged, and a remarkably high number of British soldiers, after they were discharged from the Army, joined the Army again as immediately as they could. They served in, sometimes they were able to serve in another active regiment. Many of them served in what are called garrison battalions or veteran battalions, though they were not able to be deployed overseas, but they could still perform good service for the Army in Great Britain. It was very, very, very common for the British soldiers who served in America during the Revolutionary War to have careers that lasted for well over 20 years in the Army. Some 30 years, some 40 years. I have a neat slide when I talk about soldiers at Lexington and Concord of a guy who got wounded on the very first day of the war, but he had a 40-year career in the Army. So that one thing was not like a huge event that characterized his whole career. Now that's peacetime enlistments. When it was clear that Great Britain had to make a big military commitment to this war in America, that took a little bit of time. You know, first we had what was thought to be a local uprising, a localized rebellion. And then it's like, no, this is an all-out war. We got to increase the size of the army. In December of 1775, so that's 8 months after the war began, the government changed the recruiting law to say, now you can enlist for 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever is longer. Basically saying, when the war ends, you can be discharged if you've served at least 3 years already. So some of the soldiers who served in America served under those terms. I showed you that slide in Rhode Island. About a quarter of the soldiers who were in the garrison in Rhode Island enlisted in these terms that when the war ended, which was what year? 1783, right? Then you have a big drawdown because the war is over. We don't need the army to be as big. We can discharge a lot of soldiers. All those guys who enlisted in after December 16, 1775 can be discharged. Well, the 22nd Regiment that was here in Rhode Island, in September 1783, they were in New York, and they got the orders, drawdown. You can lose a whole lot of soldiers now. And those soldiers could either be discharged and just walk away in New York and do whatever they want, take their back pay and go. They can go back to England and be discharged there if they're eligible. Or they can go to Canada and get a land grant, which some of them did. In New York, the 22nd Regiment discharged 66 soldiers. Guys who didn't choose the land grant, didn't want to go back to England. 66 of them, some of whom had served here in Rhode Island. And of those 66 soldiers, 44 of them turned around and re-enlisted immediately into another regiment that was going to Canada after the war, instead of going back to England. So even these guys who were eligible to get discharged because they had served their 3 years and the war was over, often chose to stay in the army for their career, which is a lot of why this book is called Noble Volunteers. These guys were not just like seduced or forced into the army. These were career soldiers, and often even the ones who had the option of being discharged chose not to be, which changes our perspective on what army life must have been like. A lot of authors today will just characterize it as it must have been miserable. And yet we find 2/3 of the soldiers who got discharged re-enlisted right away. Why would you do that? Couldn't have been quite that miserable. That was a good question. Other questions? There was one down here somewhere. Was there? Other questions? Here's one.
So you enlist in the army,
Mm-hmm.
unless it was a specific situation where they said 3 years. You enlist in the army, it's forever.
Uh-huh. Yes.
What does a guy do, enlist in the army, and after 2 years, this is just not for me? Is there any way to say, I don't like the army, will you let me go?
Sure. There's a way to say, I don't like the army, you can let me go. But you might not like the answer to that question because the answer will usually be, sorry, you don't have that choice. But we do find cases where, depending on what the army needed, even this gets down onto the regimental level because it's the decision of individual regimental commanders what to do with a guy like that. Well, if you're a terrible soldier and it's 1772 and we're in England and there's no wars going on and there's a lot of recruits available, commanding officer might say, you know what? We don't like you either. we're going to discharge you. Or they might say, well, you can do that, but it's going to cost you. We paid you a lot of money here. So you can buy your way out if you were clever and saved your money. Well, maybe you can't do that, but you could try. Or he might say, well, tell you what, if you can get somebody else to serve in your place, you can trade with them. And I actually have an example in this book of a guy who did just that. He went to his commanding officer and don't want to serve in the army, but my brother will serve, my little brother, he'll serve in the army. Got his little brother to serve in his place. And his little brother, fortunately, wrote this nice long discussion of his service, which is how we know that. Wasn't real happy about it, but then he was in. You know, my older brother, my brother talked me into it, and I enlisted in the army in his place. So you could ask to get out, but if it's 1777 in Rhode Island and there's a war going on and you're on a front line and you ask this question, odds are pretty good you'll be told, no, not now. But when the war ends and we have a big drawdown, that's another time to go ask again. How about now? And they might let you go. In the back?
Have you done any research on British prisoners of war? And did any of them then desert?
Oh, yes. The answer is yes to both questions. Again, Noble Volunteers is a chapter that discusses this in great detail. Lots of British prisoners of war deserted in terms of leaving their captivity. Many of them joined the Continental Army, and many of those subsequently deserted and rejoined the British Army. Some others, at the end of the war, when all prisoners were repatriated, simply never returned. And they were written off of the muster rolls as deserters. But even there's nuances. For example, 2 guys from the 34th Regiment of Foot that's posted in Quebec and other northern posts go on an expedition to a place in upstate New York near the Finger Lakes called Fort Windecker. They get captured. Now they're prisoners of war. The war ends. The regiment that's still up in Canada Prisoners of war don't come back. They're written off as deserters. But that's in Canada. If you go down to New York and look at the 22nd Regiment that had been here in Rhode Island, then went to New York, you find that in 1780, both those guys show up in New York. They escaped captivity and they got into New York and joined the army again. But if you looked only at the records from their own regiment and you see that deserters written off at the end of the war, you wouldn't know that. You know, you'd think that, okay, they were. So lots of guys left captivity. Many of them left captivity explicitly to escape. In the Battle of Rhode Island, by the way, there were about 15 or so soldiers from General Burgoyne's army. Remember Burgoyne's army that was captured at Saratoga in 1777? Those guys escaped captivity in droves. Some of them got into Rhode Island. You know, you escape from Boston, it's not that far. They got into Rhode Island, they join regiments here, they end up fighting in the Battle of Rhode Island on the British side, even though they had been members of the Southern Regiment. And eventually they got assimilated into other regiments and keep fighting. So it's a really, really neat topic because every individual has their own tale to tell, right? You can't just say, okay, it was this way. Great question. Others?
These people that were helping the soldiers escape, did the British soldiers ever get them and try them or anything?
I have not found any trial of an American tried for assisting British soldiers to desert. All of the British court-martial records from Rhode Island still exist in the British National Archives. I've got copies of all of them. And no civilian was tried for helping Americans. There were a few in New York area who were tried for exactly that, but none here. I would love to find details about who some of these people were, things like that. Haven't found any. I have to admit, I haven't looked very hard because most of my focus is on the British military records and learning who the soldiers were, as opposed to looking at the people who were around the soldiers, so to speak. That would be a neat avenue of research to try to learn more about that. Question here.
Is there any data that would be valuable to determine how those British soldiers who had left the British Army, how were they treated in America then? I mean, is there any consistency to that? I got the other book.
Yeah, so some of those guys who deserted ended up writing stories. It varied a great deal. Again, very individual stories. We don't have a lot of stories about how they were treated, but you saw in there that some of these guys, Rhode Island Council of War gives them money, stay in town. A lot of them assimilated very well. In the Massachusetts State Archives, there's a number of petitions by deserters, again, from among the prisoners of Burgoyne's army, and some of them among prisoners of Scottish soldiers who were captured at sea in 1776 and held in Boston or in the Boston area. Soldiers petition to be allowed to settle in the towns that they're in Massachusetts. And generally they're allowed to do so. They get affidavits saying, yeah, this guy has lived here for a few years now. He's married, he's settled in, he's working at some job, and he's okay. He's been a good member of the town. So this colonial state government says, okay, you can stay and become a citizen. Well, we've got a lot of records of individuals like that, but we also have records of others who were not so cooperative and things like that. Again, a lot of variation.
The assimilation was generally good.
I think I could say it's generally good. I always find words like, again, I'm an engineer. I don't like to use a word like generally because, if you say most of something, that could be 51% or 99%. And there's a big difference, but either way, you could say mostly, and that's true. So the ones that I know about generally had good experiences because that's why we know about them. But I only know about a small portion of the total. So, it's entirely possible some of these guys had a terrible time in America, so what can you do? You can go to the docks and sign on to a ship and you can go back to Great Britain, or, there's all kinds of things you can do if you don't like where you are to get away. But the ones we know about because they end up settling and assimilating. There was a question in the back?
Have you come across any information on British officers
Oh.
leaving service for any reason?
Oh, okay. British officers leaving the service for any reason. Yes. I don't study the officers as much just because other people tend to focus on them a lot. So I say, well, they don't need me. It's the rank and file soldiers who need me. But here and there are British officers who leave the service for different reasons. One prominent officer in the 22nd Regiment of Foot, who is also a member of the House of Commons or Lords, I think it was Lords actually, resigned his commission when he found out his regiment was being sent to America because he objected to fighting against his countrymen. A British officer, he served here in Rhode Island, and I'm not remembering his name right off the top of my head, but I have it in my data, resigned his commission when the British left Newport because he had married a local woman. Actually, at least one officer from the 54th Regiment did the same thing. They resigned and chose to stay and settle in this area. So yeah, here and there, but for the most part, the officers, they can quit. The soldiers can't, but the officers can. So we don't find officers deserting, we find officers resigning. And yes, there are a few. Two of the prominent officers in the Battle of Rhode Island in the 22nd Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, the regiment's commander on the field, and the next senior officer, Major Rollins Hillman, both resigned their commissions within 2 months after the battle. Both of them cite like family matters and things, but I think they were pretty angry about how the whole thing went and how their regiment was managed during the battle by the brigade commander. But that's just speculation based on the timing. But they resigned, went back to England, stayed in the army, but they had just resigned their commissions in their regiments. So different things. But yeah, officers often left, but usually under better terms. A question here.
Your picture reminds me of my question is that my understanding is some soldiers came with families.
Yes, some soldiers came with families. Yes, I didn't really...
Lot or maybe?
About 1 in 8 of the British soldiers here in Rhode Island had a wife with them. Some had families. Some did marry while they were here in Rhode Island. A few, I don't have detailed records on that detail, but yeah. So Rhode Island Garrison of total of about 2,000 British soldiers. You're talking several hundred wives of soldiers with them as part of the garrison as well. And I'm actually working on a book on that very topic about wives. It's the companion volume to this one. It's going to be about wives and families of British troops in America. Any others? Do we have time for others too, by the way? I got to ask the host. I can go on and on.
Well, Dawn,
Oh.
thank you very much for a great talk. We hope you don't have that book.
Oh, Tom Hand's book. I know the author, but I don't think I have the book.
Since you have a
Yes.
baseball cap, you get our winter cap.
Oh, all right. Oh, I'm going to need this weekend. I will need it in due time. Thank you all very much.